Thank you, Linda. Thank you. Yeah, actually, the lecture series it's a group of people that I've plagiarized, and so it's a. I was just joking. All right, all right. I want to thank everybody for coming back. You know, every lecture that we've had so far, we filled this room and then some, and so thank you so much for choosing to be here with us this evening. Tonight, we've got another fantastic speaker for you, my friend Jon Hunner, who you're going to hear from in just a moment. Before he gets started, I'd like to talk about his credentials a little bit and introduce him and his work to you. Jon is somebody who I really look up to, and I think you're going to see why in just a few minutes. So Jon is the academic head of the history department at New Mexico State University. He received his PhD from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Hunner teaches graduate and undergraduate students United States, New Mexican, and public history. He assists communities around the state in documenting, interpreting, and publicizing their history and culture. He also is an historian of the nuclear age, where his Inventing Los Alamos, the Growth of an Atomic Community, examines the creation of the atomic city, and I think he's got a copy of it over there, and lost my place. And J. Robert Oppenheimer, The Cold War and the Atomic West, which brings new insights into how the West influenced Oppenheimer and how he then transformed the West. And so I have a copy. If you covet my copy, I'm sure that you can purchase both of these outstanding books somewhere, and Jon will sign it if you can get one quick enough. Now, a little bit about Jon's personal background. Jon has lived in New Mexico most of his life and gained his 15 minutes of fame in 1976 when he juggled from Santa Fe to Albuquerque as a fundraiser for the Arthritis Foundation. I thought that was pretty cool, huh? Before becoming an historian, he was a founding member of the comedy group Rimshot, ran an art services business, and worked at the Museum of Fine Arts in Santa Fe. So I don't know if we're going to have juggling or comedy tonight, but I do know you're going to get a good talk. So please welcome my friend Jon Hunner.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for coming here for this lecture, and also thank the Bradbury Science Museum for also sponsoring this great lecture series. One thing that wasn't in the bio that Alan read was that my father administered nuclear weapons for the Air Force. So we spent a lot of time in Albuquerque because he worked at Manzano Base there. And he also was very proud of that fact. And so in our family room wall, we had photographs of above ground nuclear tests. And so just imagine as a teenager, you all had that too, right? This is one of the few places that I could say this. So imagine as a teenager watching Gilligan's Island under the shadow of Trinity. So it's great to be here. As you all know, the creation of the atomic bombs here at Los Alamos was a momentous event, not just because it ended a horrendous war, it ended World War II, but because it opened a new age. Now, we all know the important work that was done at the laboratories to have that happen, but that work wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the instant city that was created here, the instant city of Los Alamos. That supported the scientists, the engineers, the technicians, the administrators, who all made Los Alamos Laboratory work. And so what we're going to look at tonight is what went on to make that city that then supported the essential work at the laboratory. There's a couple things that I'd like to emphasize. One is that Los Alamos was invented as a city, as an instant city, as a boom city from 1943 to 1945 during the war. And it was only supposed to be for that 2-year period. It was only supposed to be for the duration of the war. But then because of the Cold War, it stayed open and it reinvented itself. So we'll be looking at that at the end of this talk of how Los Alamos reinvented itself in the post-war period into a suburb of a state that didn't have suburbs before that. New Mexico didn't have suburbs. Los Alamos is also interesting because it was a federally supported community. So after World War II, as the United States was engaged in this dire struggle with the communist country during the Cold War, is that Mike doing that? During the Cold War, Los Alamos was somewhat of a communistic city in that the federal government paid for everything here. And you could not own private property for this first period. So we'll look at that a little bit too. Finally, communities are made by the people who live here. And so we'll be looking at some of these people. Some of them were Nobel Prize winners, but even the Nobel Prize winners went shopping in the commissary, argued with their neighbors, fought with their children. So these are normal people as well, and we'll be taking a look at that. Now, just a quick little background about Los Alamos. Of course, it was a boys' school before it became the laboratory, and that's Ashley Pond, who first created this hunting lodge that didn't take off, wasn't economically feasible. 1914, he turned it into a boys' school. 1918, and so there was some infrastructure here. There was a bridge, the bridge at Ottawa Crossing, that went over the Rio Grande, but Los Alamos was isolated. Part of the reason it was isolated was this road that went up that I just took this afternoon up, and this is the new road, but this was the road that was up when it first opened up, when the lab first opened up, and one of the reasons it was chosen as a laboratory was because of its isolation. Boys from back east came to Los Alamos Boys School. Fuller Lodge, designed by John Galmin, was already here, and it was the dining hall for the boys' ranch. Boys from the Mideast, from the Midwest, from the East came here, and it was in the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt's. What am I doing here? It was in the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt's going outdoors, going west, and becoming kind of a man doing that. And so that inspired people like Ashley Pond, who created the Boys Ranch. Boys had to be outside every afternoon when they came here, even during the winter. And you'll know how severe winters can get here. Do you need to look at this, Mark? Or,
yeah, no? Maybe. Sorry.
I could just use this. Maybe just turn this off.
Yes.
Okay. So they had to be outdoors, and also they wore shorts all year round. So you see photos of them with heavy wool socks that go up over their knees, and then the shorts that just come down. Some of the people that came here, Lady Bird Johnson's brother came here. William S. Burroughs, who wrote Naked Lunch, came here, and he said he had never been so cold as when he was here that winter. This is another building from the Boys Ranch, and you can see the screened-in porches. Boys slept outdoors as well. It's, again, to harden them up. Now, in November of 1943, a convoy of Army vehicles came here. They had been to Jemez Springs, looking at that as a possible place for the laboratory, and they discounted that for several reasons. Oppenheimer said it was too gloomy. Groves thought it would not be easy to secure it. And so Oppenheimer, who had as a young man come through the Pajarito Plateau on horseback, knew of the Boys Ranch and said, "I know another place." So they came through the Valle Caldera, and they came over here to the Boys Ranch. A little bit of snow was falling. They looked at it. They went to La Fonda in Santa Fe and had a steak dinner and said, "That's the place." And this was then the place that was picked as the central laboratory for the Manhattan Project, to bring all of the scientists who had been working at universities across the country on the atomic bomb, bring them together in a central laboratory. A couple criteria: had to be isolated, had to be hooked into some type of electrical grid, had to be accessible to railroad, well, 1 out of 3, I guess, and had to be easily to be secured, which was good because it was on top of a plateau, and so they chose Los Alamos as a place for the central laboratory. The last criteria was it had to be away from an urban center, because they didn't want to blow up a city if things went bad. So they didn't want it in Chicago. It was okay to blow up part of northern New Mexico. When people first then, so that was November of 1943. Oppenheimer, who had been selected that fall as the director of this laboratory, started recruiting people, saying, "You're going to work on an essential war project. I can't really tell you what it is. You're going to go to a very beautiful place.
If you agree, then I can tell you. And people knew what Oppenheimer had been involved with nuclear physics at UC Berkeley, so they kind of knew what would go on. So if they agreed to come, they were given the address 109 East Palace. Some came by train, some drove. They came to 109 East Palace in Santa Fe, thinking, well, Santa Fe, not a bad posting, because they hadn't been told where they were really going to go. And then Dorothy McKibben, who was at the office there at 109 East Palace, said, well, you're almost there, but not quite. Gave them a temporary security pass then to get onto Los Alamos, and then showed them where to go. And during the war, this was a staging place for people who came down by bus from Los Alamos to shop, to eat dinner in Santa Fe, and then to go back up to Los Alamos. So at times, 109 East Palace was busier than the bus station, the public bus station that was right across the plaza. Now here's a map of the tech area at Site Y, and you can see here's the pond here. Some people called it was called Ashley Pond. Some people called it Ashley Pond because it was named Ashley Pond. But you can see the post office here. This is the administration building here. Here's Trinity Drive here. And this is the main part of the laboratory here. D building is where plutonium was processed, and there's a lot of different laboratories here. I could spend the next 3 days just talking about what went on in there, but what I really would like to focus on is not the work that was being done to harness the binding energy of an atom once it's split, but to talk about what was going on in the town. Where did the people from Los Alamos live when they got here? There was about 200 people on Pajarito Plateau, many of them at the Boys Ranch. There were some homesteaders. All of them were moved off by January, February 1943. And then the scientists started moving in March of 1943. And so, did I say November of 1943 earlier? I meant November of 1942, I'm sorry. And so they started moving in, and they had to live in some of the existing buildings like this. This is Oppenheimer's house on Bathtub Row. That was generously given to the Los Alamos Historical Society a year or two ago, and it's now part, or eventually will be part of the Historical Society. And this was existing at the time of the Boys Ranch, and other bathtub rows named because it was the only place on the hill that had bathtubs. So people like Oppenheimer and others, key scientists, lived on Bathtub Row. But this is the bachelor officers' quarters. And buildings were built just for the duration. They weren't built to last very long. So it was somewhat of a shoddy construction. And this was an army post. So there were a lot of military who lived here, bachelor officers' quarters. But there are also, unlike a lot of places during the war, on army posts, civilians lived here, and civilian couples and families lived here as well. And so you had a lot of civilians, you had military. Sometimes there were clashes between that. But I think eventually it all worked out. Here's the GI in his dorm, and people didn't say that they were from Los Alamos. They were given a P.O. Box 1663, and so that's birth certificates, place of birth, P.O. Box 1663, driver's license, address, P.O. Box 1663. Perhaps this GI or a GI like this, who was writing back to his girlfriend in another part of the United States, said, "Oh, I wish you were here with me in box 1663." This is the family housing, the Sunt quadruplex. It was 4 families lived in these houses, because they were close quarters. Families, when they heard that another family was coming into one of the empty quadruplexes there, they would put milk in the refrigerator. They would all greet it. There was a lot of welcoming from the different families at these places. Here's an interior of one of the Los Alamos houses. Perhaps this is what Phyllis Fisher's house looked like. She was a young bride here, was pregnant during part of this time period, and for many people who weren't working in the labs, they really didn't know why they were at Los Alamos. Sometimes I think spouses would let them know. Sometimes those spouses who did know would let other people who weren't working at the lab know. Phyllis actually found out about what was going on at the lab through her unborn child. As I said, she was pregnant at the time. Her husband Leon came and at night, and Phyllis was just kind of joking around saying, well, what should we name our child when they come? And she said, oh, what about, now their last name's Fisher. What about Uranium Fisher? And her husband Leon said, stop! And she said, all I said was, and he clapped his hand over her mouth and said, don't ever say that again. These walls are so thin, you don't know who's listening on the other side. And that night after Leon went to bed, she got out his physics textbook and realized that uranium fission might be able to create a weapon. And that's how she found out about why they were on the hill. There was a lot of overcrowding at Los Alamos, as you can imagine. Los Alamos went from about 200 in the fall of 1942 to about 5,000 at the end of the war. So there was a lot of temporary housing, and you can see that here's some of the temporary housing. These, of course, are residences. These are the latrines. So there's one here, there's one here, there's one there for all of these people. Sometimes there was spills of sewage. It wasn't very sanitary, but people flocked here from around the United States, from around New Mexico, from Europe. Immigrant physicists came here and scientists came here. Some people lived down in this Espanola Valley and got on buses and came up here to work during the day and then went back down to the valley at night. So there were quite a few different ways that people arrived here at the Los Alamos. Here's a close-up of a hutment. And one of the interesting characters that I found in my research was a guy called Bences Gonzalez. He had lived here at the Boys Ranch, worked at the Boys Ranch, and then transitioned to work in the commissary when it became a laboratory. Because of the overcrowding and lack of housing here, there was a plan to put Hispanic families who lived in this area into small hutments like this. When Bences Gonzalez heard about that, he threatened to go to his representative and say, and complain about this. And just the mere threat of going to a representative about this, because it was top secret, they said, oh, okay, we'll find better accommodations for you. I'll talk about him in another time as well. There are Quonset huts as homes, and some of these Quonset huts you still see scattered around northern New Mexico. So sometimes they just pop up. Here's a nice picture, and I have to be honest, I don't know if this is during the Manhattan Project, during the war, or a little bit after, but here's sometime in the 40s, here's a photograph of downtown Los Alamos. This is the MP headquarters. Security was tight. All mail was read coming into and going out of Los Alamos. All phone conversations were listened to. Oppenheimer was required to have a driver, and that driver was there partly to make sure that he didn't have an accident, but partly it was to keep tabs on where he went, because there was suspicions about Oppenheimer's allegiance, especially about his Communist Party background. And we don't have time to go into that now, but there was, when Groves picked Oppenheimer to become director, his own Army security agents refused to give him security clearance because the FBI had flagged him as either a Communist Party member or at least a sympathizer. And his wife, Kitty, had been a Communist Party member. His brother was a Communist Party member or had been a Communist Party member. So there was a lot of doubt about him. So they assigned a driver to him just to keep tabs on him. Here is the core of MPs at Los Alamos, and they patrolled hallways at night in the tech area to make sure that somebody didn't leave top secret information on top of their desks. They had safes to put it into, and they patrolled around. There's photographs of MPs on horses riding around the perimeter of Los Alamos as well. One of the key groups of people who are here were the SEDs, the Special Engineering division, I think, division. And these were grad students or recent grad students from physics, mainly physics backgrounds. And some of them enrolled, some of them were drafted into the Army. And then they found their ways, because of their work in physics, found their way up here on the Hill, or also to Oak Ridge and Hanford as well. And they provided support for the scientists and were essential for the success of the Manhattan Project. Let me just also give a plug for land-grant universities. I come from a land-grant university. Frank Saz, who some of you know, and he wrote the book, The Day the Sun Rose Twice, he claims that one of the successes of Los Alamos were, of course, the scientists, but it was also the engineers who came from land-grant universities around the country, who then brought their expertise to Los Alamos, that also then enabled the scientists to build the weapons that they did. Here's a nurse's dormitory. And again, notice the clapboard structures there and the construction. Also notice that car, because I think that's the same car as this car here. So this is the Vicchio's. This is Nurse Vicchio, and then her husband there. I think that's the car there. She was here in November 1944. Married people could stay together, unlike normal Army posts during the war. So Nurse Vicchio worked at this hospital. The hospital was built mainly for industrial accidents. This was an industrial site using high explosives, and so there were accidents or potential accidents for that. But what happens when couples stay together is that there was, shall we say, a critical mass at the at the hospital, at the maternity ward. And so there were a lot of children born here. A baby boom happened with couples together, and General Groves was unhappy about this. He thought that was a waste of resources to start assigning doctors here to take care of pregnant women and young children, and so he one of the times he visited here, he took Oppenheimer aside and he said, "You know, you have to do something about all these civilians having babies." Oppenheimer demurred, saying that it really wasn't the role of the director of the laboratory to talk to the people like that. It was also probably, Kitty was also pregnant at the time. But a limerick swept the community, and it went like this. The general's in a stew. He trusted you and you. He thought you'd be scientific. Instead, you're just prolific. And what's the general to do? They did start providing for, there were some families that came here with children to begin with, even some teenagers, but they did also start providing for the baby boom. Here's the nursery school. Here's the central school, and that was built to qualifications that Groves really didn't approve. He wanted a kind of a quick two-story structure to take care of the classrooms. Captain Deke Parsons, and some of you might know him as a person who armed the bomb on the Enola Gay. He was a school board president and associate director of the lab, and he said, "I insisted on an up-to-date plant. Both our girls are in this school." Groves then came after he saw this school and he said, I hold you personally responsible for this, Parsons. I don't think Parsons cared too much because he was Navy, and of course Groves was Army. You would think that in a place like Los Alamos during the war, they would have had great classes, but that's not really the case, at least during the war. During the war, anybody who had some aptitude in STEM, in science, technology, in engineering, and math worked at the lab. So maybe somebody would come here and start teaching math and say, you can do math, and then would go work in the lab for that essential work. So during the war itself, it wasn't a real good school until after the war, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, how did being at this place that was working on this weapon affect young children? Well, some of you know this experiment called tickling the dragon's tail, and a plug of either uranium or plutonium was dropped through maybe a sphere, and I know I have this all wrong, and Alan can correct me, but to see what type of chain reaction would occur just for that minute that it goes through that donut hole. And so I interviewed a woman by the name of Ellen Wilder Bradbury Reed, And her father was working on tickling the dragon's tail on this experiment. And so she must have heard something about that because of the lack of housing here. When they first came here, they were housed in tents at Bandelier. They had campfires. So she was 5 years old. And so she had heard that they were making a big weapon up here. But for somebody who was 5 years old, had known war her whole conscious life, that wasn't very impressive. She had also heard that if a lizard ran through a fire, it turned into a dragon. So all summer long, she herded lizards to go through the campfire. And finally she succeeded. And she got so scared that she ran to the ranger who was there at Bandelier, who was armed, and said, come here, there's going to be a dragon. But the way I interpret that is she had heard something about weapons and dragons and thought, I'll make a really unique secret weapon, a dragon. There was entertainment here. There was this was a pressure cooker. People worked 6, maybe even 7 days a week at times to get the job done here. But you did need rest and relaxation. I'll go over a little bit of that. There were movies. This is theater number 1. And the movies were current movies, but also maybe on a Saturday night there might be a dance where beer was served. Some of these theaters, there are a couple theaters here. Then Sunday morning would have a church service. So in with the stale cigarette smoke and kind of stale beer, you'd also be having a Sunday service the next day. Now, I'm not sure if it's this one or another theater, but one of the theaters that we're here is now up at Ojo Caliente. So next time you're up at Ojo Caliente, that kind of general hardware store there, that was moved from here off of the hill down to Ojo Caliente. There was a little theater group here as well. And they did different types of plays. In one of the production of Arsenic and Old Lace, that's the one where all these corpses kind of start arising. Well, the first corpse was Oppenheimer. Next one was Fermi. Next one was Hans Bethe. And other key personnel in the laboratory. They were rising from the dead in the production. There was a tech area post-exchange. You could go to Santa Fe or Española to buy some things, but it did necessitate going through security, getting a bus down, going through security, coming back. So a lot of people just stayed on the hill and shopped at the PX or at the commissary. And here's a photo of the post-exchange. Now at the commissary, where you got things to eat, vegetables, meat, milk, things like that, the Army trucked in vegetables, and they almost always arrived wilted and stale and things like that. And so Bencis Gonzalez once again came to the rescue saying, there's people down in Española Valley who are growing vegetables. Why don't we just buy our vegetables from local people and bring them up here? And it was like, oh, that's a good idea. And so they started getting more fresh vegetables at the commissary. Also, the community radio station, CRS, was established here. And it wasn't sent out broadcast through a tower, wireless. It was because the fear was that if an enemy bomber picked up that, it could serve as a beacon to then bring enemy bombers to then bomb Los Alamos. So what they did is they put out their signal through the electrical wires. And because Los Alamos was connected through the grid to other communities, all of a sudden, other communities started hearing this weird radio station called KRS, and it never said where it was from. Dorothy McKibben said that her friends down in Albuquerque couldn't imagine where the broadcast was coming from, and there were no last names. Chris, let's see, there was children's stories by Betty, newscast by Bob, Mozart sonatas by Otto. Had them guessing. Well, the Mozarts were played by Otto Frisch, who was one of the people who realized with Lisa Meitner on that snowy woods, walk through the woods in Sweden, that the German scientist had split the atom. So, Mozart by Otto. This just shows you some of the scientific talent that were here, that were working in the laboratory or in the field at some of the test sites, but also got together at times. So here's Ernest Lawrence, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1939, Enrico Fermi, who had won the Nobel in Physics in 1938, and I. Rabi, who won the Nobel in 1944. And so there were parties here, and let me just read you one quote from. I'll read you. Let me read you two quotes. So Bernice Brody, who put together that wonderful book, Tales of Los Alamos. Is that right? Tales of Los Alamos, and it's a great account of Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Bernice Brody recalled, quote, "On Saturdays we raised whoopee. There were always too many people, too much noise, and too much liquor." And Elsie McMillan said, "We had parties, yes, once in a while, and I've never drunk so much as I did there at the few parties, because you had to let off steam. You had to let off this feeling eating your soul. Oh God, are we doing right?" Here's Oppie. He was a complicated person. Here he is at maybe a couple parties here. I think this one is actually at his home, because that window and this ledge is still there. So it's probably at his home that he lived in. Again, I could spend an hour just talking about him or more, but he was a complicated person. I like to say that if he had not become director, and it was a weird choice because he had not held an administrative position before he became director. He had not even been the chair of his physics department at Berkeley. But I say that if it hadn't been for him, that Los Alamos might not have succeeded as soon as it did. Partly because he had a phenomenal memory. We could sit in a room, maybe with this many people, and all of you could say what you're doing with your research and the problems you're having or the successes you're having, and then at the end of the meeting, within just a few minutes, he could summarize what went on in the meeting to the satisfaction of everybody there that he had heard me. And so that was a gift that he had, probably because of his memory. He was brilliant, he was charismatic, but he also was sharp. And he could cut people down if he thought that they were somewhat slow. And there's ghost of his management here. Actually, I don't know. It used to be that the lab had seminars that started at 8:15. Is that still true? Seminars or symposiums start at 8:15 at the lab? Not anymore? Well, I was lucky enough to be here at the 50th anniversary, at the 60th anniversary, and in those we had a meeting at 8:15, and Richard Rhodes commented that was when Oppenheimer liked to start meetings in the morning. So, but it's still, I think his legacy still lives on, and I'm very glad to be here at the 70th as well. Here's a monthly NCO party. I don't think these guys are asking if they're doing right. They would borrow bowls from the lab. They would go down to Santa Fe or Espanola and buy some alcohol and would pour a lot and would let off some steam. And then here's an electrician's office party. And it was probably at something like this when one of the Army Corps of Engineer officers was bragging about how strong, the buildings were, and one of the women said, "Oh yeah," and gave him a little shove, and he just went right through the wall. And she said, "Yeah, that's pretty strong." There was a ski slope, as there still is now, Pajarito ski Pajarito, something like that, ski Pajarito. But that started during the Manhattan Project. And one of the a scientist who was here, who was a guy by the name of Kistiakowski, took some of the high explosives, wrapped them around some of the trees, and kind of cleared the slopes that way. Here's Neil Bohr on one of his visits here, skiing. And then here is a ski party at the top of the mountain. There was also picnics when it was a little warmer. You'd go and do picnics. Even at parties, there were intense discussions about the business of the lab. And one of the characters here is Richard Feynman right here. So let's see, I think here, I can't tell which one of that is Oppenheimer. One of those Oppenheimer. But here's Feynman. Feynman is to me one of these great characters that came here. He came here just at the very end of his graduate career, and I think maybe he was already got his PhD. And he became kind of the trickster figure of Los Alamos. And he bedeviled the MPs. He had a sick wife in Albuquerque, and so he would write her letters in code. He would include the code in the letters so that the MPs could read that and say, oh, okay, they're not anything. But they said, no, you can't do that. So because of his ongoing fight with the MPs, because he was somewhat of a mischievous guy, he would know how to just get things passed just barely through the censors. He also found a hole in the fence, and he would go out of the fence, and then he would come back in through the gate, and they'd record Richard Feynman. And then, an hour later, he'd go out the hole in the fence, and he'd come back, and they didn't have any departure. I mean, he was always coming in; he was never leaving. So he's one of my favorite characters. Here he is here. Later on in life, was it the Columbia shuttle disaster? He was the one who put the O-ring in the glass of ice water at the hearings, and then hit it on the table, and the O-ring shattered. It's very dramatic, and that was Richard Feynman towards the end of his life. Here's a photograph of the tech area at Los Alamos, and this is the building that Oppenheimer is in, the administrative building. Ashley Pond is on the other side of that. But you can see that there were fences here. Here's a guard gate here. So you had to show your pass to get in there. This is, of course, where the administrators were. But the rest of this area are some of the labs. And I don't know which. Maybe this is Building D. Alan, you might know which is Building D there. Yeah, so Building D, where plutonium was processed after it was brought down from Hanford, was right there. In addition to trying to figure out how to harness this release of energy when atoms were split, there was also a lot of high explosives involved as well. So here's MPs with the practice bomb, which was the real purpose of Los Alamos, was blowing things up and trying to figure out then how to blow them up even bigger with an atomic bomb. Here, testing explosives. This is a night test, but in some of my interviews after the war with Ellen Bradbury, Wilder Bradbury Reed, she said that they'd be sitting in their schoolrooms, and everybody knew, and this is in the post-war period, everybody knew that explosives went off at 10, 12, and 3. And her dad worked in some of those testing areas, and if an explosion went off at a time that wasn't 10, 12, or 3, it was like, uh-oh, was that an accident? Was my dad there? She also bragged that they got connoisseurs of explosions, like, boom, it's like, okay, or boom, boom. She said they really liked the big ones. If it went boom, boom, ba, boom, it was like they'd look around and go, yeah, that was a good one. It was a good one. Of course, the reason for Los Alamos was creating a nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb. So here's a photograph of Fat Man on the tower at Trinity site in July of 1945. Some of you might recognize here Norris Bradbury on top of the tower. And these, all of these are electrical wires that go into the high explosive lenses that surrounded the plutonium in the middle of it. Plutonium about the size of a grapefruit, and you probably all know this better than I do. But those explosive lenses then had the shock wave to compress the plutonium, and that compression, that implosion of the plutonium, is then what caused the chain reaction and set off the plutonium there. So that's why it's shaped like that. And of course, that was successful on July 16th, 1945 in the morning. Let me do this. Here's two photographs of the Trinity. And let me read an eyewitness account. This is my favorite eyewitness account by Joan Henson, who was a graduate student in physics from Wisconsin, who was working on the nuclear reactor here at Los Alamos. And she observed the blast from the hill that was 25 miles away. She said, it was like, quote, it was like being at the bottom of an ocean of light. We were bathed in it from all directions. The light withdrew into the bomb as if the bomb sucked it up. Then it turned purple and blue and went up and up and up. We were still talking in whispers when the cloud reached the level where it was struck by the rising sunlight. So it cleared out the natural clouds. We saw a cloud that was dark and red at the bottom and daylight on the top. Then suddenly the sound reached us. It was very sharp and rumbled, and all the mountains were rumbling with it. So that was July 16th, 1945. And of course, as you all know, in August of 1945, 2 bombs were delivered, first to Hiroshima on August 6th, and then Nagasaki on August 9th, and that ended the war. The casualty in Hiroshima was, about 70 to 80,000 people died on the day, which was about 30% of the population. And by November of 1945, another 130 had died in Hiroshima. Nagasaki wasn't quite as lethal because the hills kind of bounced some of the effects away. Here's the front page article of the Santa Fe New Mexican. This, of course, announced to everybody what was going on in Los Alamos. There had been some wild stories about what had gone on. That they were making windshield wipers for submarines, that they were making the front end of donkeys to ship to Washington, D.C. for final assembly, that this was a place for pregnant wax, which actually I think is interesting because there were so many pregnant women around here who then would go down to Santa Fe, and the Santa Feans, these people aren't from Santa Fe, that they might say, well, maybe this is a place for pregnant wax. Now, this was a quantum leap in destructive ability. One B-29 delivered 1 bomb. And you can see here, even right after, this is on August 6th, so utter destruction, I can't quite, but something about unleashed power equals 2,000 superforts. So this was 1 superfort delivering 1 bomb was the equivalent of 2,000 fully loaded bombs using conventional weapons. So that's the quantum leap in destruction that the atomic bomb brought. When this was announced, there was excitement on the Hill. There were celebrations throughout the county, throughout the country, and rightfully so. Would bring about the end of the most horrendous war in human history, a war where millions of civilians and millions of military personnel died fighting different forces around the world. And perhaps it needed a horrendous weapon like this to end the horrendous war the way it did. That's something that we could talk about later if you want. It's still open to debate amongst atomic historians. Let's just in the next few minutes talk about what happened to Los Alamos after the war. It was only supposed to be up for the duration of the war, create a bomb and then go home. But the Cold War happened really even before Japan surrendered. This tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was rising even during some of the summits before the war was over and before VJ Day. And so it was decided that Los Alamos would stay open and would continue working on these weapons as a guarantee to keep the United States free. Many of the personnel during the Manhattan Project did leave. They went back to their university jobs if they were scientists, or maybe the private industry if they were engineers or chemists or things like that. So the question then was how to attract the key personnel to continue this work. And one of the ways that they decided to do that was to create a modern community here, to create a suburb. Now, there were no suburbs in New Mexico at the time. Los Alamos was the first suburb, and it wasn't a suburb of Santa Fe, it wasn't a suburb of anywhere else in New Mexico, it was more a suburb of Washington, D.C. Might still be? Nuclear physics scientists were rock stars. Well, they were celebrities. Oppenheimer graced the cover of Time magazine. And you can see here kind of this, convertible and shades and a Hawaiian shirt coming to work at the lab. And so people around the United States wanted to be near these scientists who harnessed this incredible energy, ended this horrendous war, and part of it was just because of the incredible work that was done during the war. Part of it was, though, concern about the future. Oppenheimer would give lectures, oftentimes in the United States, sometimes in England. In England, those lectures, which were sold out, and they put up loudspeakers outside so people could hear it. They were recorded by BBC and broadcast around the world. They quickly turned into published books, and they became bestsellers because people wanted to know what the scientist who had created the bomb thought about the future. And so that was another reason that they became celebrities. Los Alamos also created superior schools to rectify the schools that weren't so good during the war. And here is that actually still might be Central School. But money was appropriated through the federal government, through the Atomic Energy Commission, to augment the amount of money that was given to Los Alamos schools by the state. So in 1948, Los Alamos spent $308 a year per pupil for its students. By comparison, the United States, on average, spent $180. So 180 average across the U.S. In New Mexico, that number was 165. So Los Alamos schools almost had twice as much money for its students per student than the rest of New Mexico. So this is another way to attract the scientists and their families to come to Los Alamos because of this superior school. And in my oral histories, people said it was like going to a private academy. Some of the students who came here went to private academies elsewhere, came here, went to this school. It was comparable to a private academy. Another question was how to protect the community. Los Alamos, of course, would be ground zero in case of an attack by the Soviet Union. And so Los Alamos, as well as other communities in the United States, Los Alamos became a test community. And so in the 1950s, they tested what to do with communities. And one of the things was, let's do a mass evacuation. So you can see the massive traffic jam as people were trying to leave the hill and some of the few roads off of the hill. But what was learned here was then sent to other places around the country as a way to survive an atomic attack. I remember in the late 50s, we were stationed at Sandia Base in Albuquerque, and in the middle of July, my parents threw me and my two brothers in our station wagon. We drove out into the desert in the middle of July, drove out into the desert without air conditioning, and then got stuck in a traffic jam like this. And we got out of the car and my mom yelled, "Watch out for rattlesnakes!" And but these community evacuations were something that were done around the country. Los Alamos continued to then produce nuclear weapons. The test on the left there is Operation Sandstone in 1948, and on the right, of course, is the first hydrogen bomb test in 1952. And the hydrogen bomb is probably about 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let me just conclude by saying Los Alamos was a unique community, probably still is a fairly unique community, 1943 as well as today. It's a suburb in a state that didn't have suburbs beforehand, and its burb, if I can say that, is more Washington, D.C. than anywhere else in New Mexico. Los Alamos was on the front lines of the Cold War, and not just the military and nuclear weapons development front lines, but also the scientific and the social front lines. This creation of a new way of living a suburban living with also the concern that maybe it would be your barbecue grill would be ground zero. And so that was one of the things that they tested here as well, was what to do with that. Faced with the challenges of the atomic age, as one of the first communities to confront this was something that Los Alamos did. From a boom town like the rest of, or like some of the towns in the Wild West, Los Alamos then became an atomic West, and it transformed this part of the country, west of the Mississippi River. Before that, west of the Mississippi River was kind of a poor stepchild to the industrial might of the eastern part of the United States. Los Alamos helped reorient the country from looking to the east to looking towards the west as a pace setter in scientific development, a pace setter in how to deal with the Cold War and the atomic age, pace setter in dealing with the federal government and support with that. And so we became this pace setter, and now pace setter in style as well. I think I've overtalked my welcome here. Are there any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Are there any questions? We'll take one from the overflow. No, okay, here. Question here. Yes. Uh-huh. No. So the question is, with that, with one of the plays put on by the Little Theater Group, especially Arsenic and Old Lace, were those people actually the scientists? Was that actually Oppenheimer and Fermi and Bethe? And yeah, those were actually. I mean, they were good sports. So it was actually them. Yes.
So John, I just want you to know they're going to reprise Arsenic and Old Lace this year, and the current director has agreed to be a corpse.
Very nice. Very nice. Other questions? Yes.
Did Oppenheimer continue to be sort of watched the whole time he was in Los Alamos because of his earlier communist activities? I get that he was.
The question is, was Oppenheimer continually under surveillance the whole time he was here at Los Alamos? And yeah, he was. The few times that he took trips elsewhere, in the summer of 1943, he went back to the Bay Area, and he was followed around. He had some meetings at UC Berkeley, and then later that night, he went over to a former girl's friend's apartment and stayed there all night long. And of course, the agents duly recorded that, and then they brought that up to him when he was under his security clearance hearing in 1954, and they brought that up, and actually that came up when Oppenheimer's wife Kitty was sitting next to him, so that's the first she had heard about that. So, and then he was under surveillance afterwards as well. He was somewhat immune in the early post-war period because of his success at creating this weapon that ended the war. But they continued to especially during the war, Groves said to the FBI, "Hands off. Army security will take care of watching Oppenheimer." But then after the war, FBI started following him again, and in my research, I went through 3 rolls of microfilm of the FBI files on Oppenheimer. So there's hundreds and hundreds of documents, and and where he followed, and he had a beer at this hotel in Washington D.C., or transcripts of telephone conversations that he had with Kitty. Now, as a historian, that was great. It was great to actually have somebody transcribe conversations of the person I'm studying. I think Oppenheimer would defer, would say no, but still, I mean, there was quite a lot of surveillance of Oppenheimer after the war. Yes, sir.
As it turned out, their fears of Oppenheimer were unfounded, but were there any other cases that came to light of others who had tried?
The question is, of course, the fears of Oppenheimer being a spy were unfounded, but you're asking, were there spies here at Los Alamos? Is that what you're asking, sir? Yes, there were spies, and actually, in the Manhattan Project, some of them continue to be uncovered. Now, of course, probably the spy that did the most damage was Klaus Fuchs, who was a German physicist who, because he was a communist, fled Berlin, went to England, and was told by the Communist Party not to go to any Communist Party meetings. go deep cover. And he then was part of the British mission that was brought over here, and then he handed a satchel with a lot of information about how to make atomic bombs in, I think, April of 1945 to an agent by the name of Harry Gold, who had come here from the Soviet consulate in New York City by train, and he collected that satchel, that briefcase from Fuchs, and then also collected something from a guy by the name of Greenglass, who had worked on this in the shop making these explosive lenses. Fuchs was probably very damaging. That information went right to Soviet Union and was the blueprint for their successful bomb in 1949. There were a couple other, Theodore Hall. Theodore Hall was a U.S. So those were two, Fuchs and Greenglass. And Greenglass was Communist Party. He was partly doing it because of Communist Party, but he got paid by gold. And then there's Theodore Hall, who just in one of his trips off the hill went to the consulate in New York City and said, "I'm working on this, and I think that it's such a powerful weapon that it shouldn't just be owned by the United States." And so he gave some information as well. There's, I'm forgetting, who recently came to light? Yeah, so there's a code name Perseus in the Verona files, and some people say Perseus was Oppenheimer, other people say not. So there might have been another spy here. Once in a while, us atomic historians get very excited because we think we know who Perseus is, but then it doesn't come out. There was also a GRU agent, and I can't tell you what that means, but that's kind of the FBI of the Soviet military. And I forget his name. And he actually was U.S. born, of Communist Party parents, who immigrated to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and then he was trained by the GRU. So he was trained by this secret force within the Soviet military, and then came back and worked as a sergeant at Oak Ridge. And he had run of the place. He could go anywhere. That came out just a few years ago when Putin awarded this person posthumously one of the highest medals of Russia. And it was like, who is this guy? And it was like, oh my gosh, he was a spy against the Manhattan Project. So yes, there were some spies here, and successfully, it's the first Soviet atomic bomb was Blueprint Los Alamos, from what Klaus Fuchs sent them. They went on to then make their own styles of nuclear weapons, but that first one was from the plans that were stolen from here. Another question. Yes?
You showed a photo of Niels Bohr
Uh-huh.
skiing on Sawyer's Hill. Apart from skiing, do you know what Bohr did while he was here?
So the question is, I had a photograph of Niels Bohr, the Danish nuclear physicist who, and I'm probably going to simplify this, but kind of came up with the solar system kind of construction of an atom. And a lot of people went there and then came here. So the question was, what else did he do here besides ski? And he was a consultant. He was revered by the nuclear physicists just because of what he had done already. He was along in his years when he came here. But not only was he here, but his son was here as well. And I don't know how much he was here and how much his son was here. I think his son might have been here a little bit more than Bohr was, but he was here as a consultant. Do you want to add anything to that?
I've not seen an awful lot of evidence regarding technical contributions. I think that we do have a couple of records in the archives that I think maybe some presentations, something like that. But I would agree very much with what you said. He and Augie both. All the British mission folks who came here in particular during the war contributed to that international sense of physics, science without borders. And I think that contributed greatly to the work that was done here and to morale.
So he definitely provided a lot of moral support for the scientists who were working here. There was another hand. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. My question relates to native New Mexicans. So for instance, we didn't see, for example, the homesteaders and how they were displaced, or
why do native northern New Mexicans not receive the attention that they deserve for their work throughout the Manhattan Project and post-Manhattan?
So the question is, why don't native northern New Mexicans, including many Native Americans and Hispanics in northern New Mexico, receive credit for the work that they did up here on the Hill? And I will shamelessly plug my book, where I did address that at times. I talked about some of the people who came here from the Espanola Valley and worked here, and many of them worked as laborers, driving trucks. There was a group of women from San Ildefonso who came up every day to clean houses of women who were working at the lab and had children and things like that. But there was also some people like Popo Vida, who was the son of Maria Martinez, and he helped with some of the scientific work here too, and then also helped integrate what was happening at the lab with what was going down at the Pueblo. And there's an interesting event that happened at the end of the war, after the war was over, where people from Los Alamos went down to San Ildefonso and danced. And the people from the Hill did square dances, and the people from San Ildefonso Pueblo did different types of their ceremonial dances, and people danced together. And the governor at one point got up on a table with one of the drums and was beating the drum and was chanting, "This is the atomic age." The lab wouldn't have happened without the help from the people like Bencis Gonzalez, who I mentioned a couple times, and provided some of the key work that was done here, and that continues to this day. There's an interesting study done in the 1990s from UNM by a guy by the name of Carlos Vasquez, who wanted to know, and Carlos lived up here as a teenager, and he wanted to know how people who live down in the Espanola Valley can come up and work here and then go back to their homes that they sometimes have been in their family for centuries. And I think he called it low-tech in a high-tech world, something like that. And what he concluded by interviewing people who from Espanola, from Okeowinge, from Cuyamongue, from places like that, is that these people find it very easy to walk in two worlds. They find it easy to commute and work up on the hill in some very sophisticated jobs, and then go back and maybe open the acequia to water the apple orchard that has been in their family for generations. So Carlos concluded that this was kind of key to preserving some of the heritage that goes back a long time, was to have high-paying jobs up here that allowed them to then preserve their lifestyles that are rooted in go back generations there. Yes.
In your studies, did you find any evidence of anti-Semitism that went on during the Los Alamos days? So many of the scientists were Jewish.
The question is, in my research, did I find any evidence of anti-Semitism? I can't say that I did up here on the Hill. It was difficult to practice Judaism up here. I mean, where are you going to get matzah? I mean, and so to help celebrate some of those holy days, people had to write back to their relatives in Chicago or New York and say, send some of those, some of that goods that we need to make the meals that are appropriate at these time periods. There was, if I remember correctly, there was no temple here, especially during the World War II. But some of the time, some of the churches shared either churches when they got established or went to the theaters. But I can't recall any anti-Semitism, at least here on the Hill. Another question. Yes.
The Civilian Conservation Corps had camps all over New Mexico, a large one in Bandolera. And many of those workers military. Were a number of them brought up here to help build Los Alamos?
The question is that there were a lot of CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps camps around New Mexico, including down in Bandelier. And when they were closed in 1942, because we were at war, were some of and a lot of those CCC guys went into the military. Were they brought up here to build Los Alamos? No, the people who built Los Alamos were private contractors. McGee was one of the key ones and one of the ones that comes to mind, and so they brought up their own guys to do a lot of the building. But it was also Army Corps of Engineer. So the Army Corps of Engineer also was in charge of building here at Los Alamos. So I haven't seen any. I mean, maybe some of the CCC guys went into the military and then were assigned here, but there wasn't a group that made the transition from New Mexico CCC camps to Los Alamos. Yeah.
Were the homesteaders who were displaced by this project compensated for their land, and was it returned to them after the project was over?
The question is, were the homesteaders who were displaced, mainly Hispanic homesteaders, who were displaced by the creation of Los Alamos, were they compensated and were they allowed to come back? They were not allowed to come back. I'm not sure if they were fully compensated. They might have been a little bit, but probably not to what they wanted. But a lot of them did get jobs here, like Bences Gonzalez. And the Boys Ranch were also supposed to be compensated, not as much as they thought it was. I'm going to say $235,000, but that's just off the top of my head.
One thing I'll add is the first event that we had as a part of this series was a roundtable discussion on the homesteading era, and that's available at the Bradburys. You can watch it on the Bradbury Science Museum's website, and so I'd encourage you to look at that. There's also a book that Department of Energy has put out very recently, and those were given away at that event, covering the homesteading era. I'm not an expert on that. My colleague Ellen McGee is probably the most knowledgeable person. Ellen, Dorothy Horde, the women who participated in that panel discussion, they would be the real experts. But I do believe the people at the time were compensated. But many years later, there was a lawsuit brought against the federal government, which determined that they had not received enough compensation, and so the publication of that book was actually part of the settlement in that lawsuit, is my understanding. But again, Ellen is the expert on that, and I'd encourage you to watch the homesteading panel that we've had available.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming, and please come to the next one in June. Thank you very much.